Hello, very beautiful community. I'm pissed off. And I get pissed off only when a particular issue is illustrative of a broader pattern that affects all of our democracies, which should really, really wind us up. So, what's actually happened is much bigger than it seems. The Director General of the BBC has resigned. The BBC head of news has resigned. Other people might resign. And the context here is that the BBC has made some systematic mistakes, but it is also under a semi-coordinated attack by a post-truth populist right campaign that's now international, against which the BBC doesn't know how to defend itself, and about which the BBC at board level is in conflict with itself. A beautiful friend of mine told me an image the other day to do with the decline of democracy. And she said, it's really important that while lights are dimming for us, there are still a lot of lights at the top of the hill, the top of different hills, and we must be really protective of them. That's a little bit of a sentimental image, but it's also very evocative. We've got to protect those lights at the top of the hill, even when lights lower down are going out. And so this BBC story is one of the lights at the top of the hill shimmering. I'm so sorry for the kitsch sentimentality of the imagery, but I think the imagery is also very evocative. Quite a few months ago, and I'm sorry I'm going to give a few details, but the details matter. The BBC made a mistake in a panorama program about Trump. What's the BBC generally supposed to do? What is its purpose? Now, in my assessment, the BBC has two purposes. One is to give the news as impartially as is conceivably possible in an age of cataclysmic polarization and epistemic catastrophe. Number one. Number two, to do programming, whether that be fictionalized programming or documentaries, that speaks to the country as a whole, about the world and about what the country is in that world. And so when it comes to the first function, impartial news, the key value there is truthfulness. When it comes to quality programming that speaks to the country, the two values there are education and solidarity. In the program about Trump, the BBC made a mistake that we talked about on a recent video on the chat channel. I won't replay it for us, but as I say a few of the things that I'm going to say spontaneously, I might attach some things on the screen just to help give you context. The mistake was that in Trump's January 6th speech, the BBC took a line of his from the beginning of the speech and a line of his from the end of the speech and put them together. This was wrong. Did it misrepresent the fundamental meaning of Trump's speech by making it out like he was inciting something which he wasn't inciting? It didn't, because Trump indeed was inciting something. However, the BBC made a mistake because they misrepresented the way he was inciting it. He was inciting it in a more post-truth way than the more direct way that quote, these two quotes being pieced together may have implied. They put together something like, we've got to go there from the beginning of the speech with, we've got to fight from the end of the speech. The thing is that there was a post-truth incitation there by Trump, because the speech was, let's be peaceful, let's fight, let's not fight, let's be peaceful. let's be fightful, peaceful, fight, peace, peace. Post-truth communication, right? So the idea is to say something without saying it. This is difficult for journalists to report, and so I can see how there was a risk that this error would be made. And it is indeed an error. Specifically, it's the error of not conveying that this was a post-truth incitation, right? And instead implying too much that it was a more direct incitation. We're in the age of post-truth politics, and so the BBC needed to be clear about this and get this right. When I say the BBC, I don't mean the BBC. We're just talking about an editor and the producer making a mistake, and then people above them not catching it. And I don't mean the mistake as in a slip, a mistake as in a serious mistake of judgment, right? Now, here is the problem. The chair of the BBC today has written a statement. It's a letter to a committee of members of parliament, which admits that it was wrong to put together the two Trump quotes, and that this misrepresented what Trump was saying, how he was saying it. But he doesn't defend the BBC on the big picture, that the program in the end didn't fundamentally misrepresent what Trump was doing in that speech. That is extraordinary submissiveness to post-truth populism. Is it submissiveness out of passivity, out of fear? Is it submissiveness out of the fact that the chair isn't able to side with the BBC properly? Is it submissiveness or passivity because there's too much conflict on the board to render a kind of statement that would defend the BBC properly here? That doesn't matter for my purposes. What matters is that the statement is a shocker. It's a shocker because the effect of the statement is to imply that the BBC admits that it was wrong to say that Trump was engaged in incitational speech, which it isn't wrong because that's the correct interpretation of what he did. This is pandering to post-truth authoritarian right populism. And this matters because it's not a BBC story. It's what will happen little by little, like water coming to the boil, with all of our media institutions in the West, unless we begin waking up and learning the dynamics of how you do effective fight back in these circumstances. Now, because the board was divided, the BBC neither admitted its mistake, nor defended it for days and days and days and days. So there was this vacuum in which a very large post-truth authoritarian right campaign developed. The post-truth populist ex-UK Prime Minister Liz Truss weighed in. The post-truth buffoon populist Trump supporter Boris Johnson weighed in. The Telegraph was weighing in all week, as was the Daily Mail. And then President Trump weighed in with this message we're going to put on here because it's important that you see it. And he talks about the head of the BBC going, I think. And of course, Trump wouldn't have known who that was until he had to tweet it. And talks about the BBC doctoring him. This then was followed by Trump threatening legal action against the BBC in the form of a $1 billion lawsuit. Meanwhile, the BBC is not defending the fact that it got the broad point right, but made an unacceptable journalistic error on the form of that the broad point needed to take. And the error was to misrepresent Trump's incitation as being more direct than it really was, because in fact it was a post-truth incitation. Now, this whole story is big because a dossier was leaked, which made a set of criticisms of the BBC around impartiality. Now, the criticisms of the dossier were about coverage of Trump, and the dossier said that the edit of Trump's speech completely, and there was one other important word there, that it completely and meaningfully, or something like that, misrepresented the point of Trump's speech. It didn't. The program represented Trump's speech pretty fairly, with the exception of this error. But that's not a mistake at the level of what the speech was about. So that dossier contains post-truth Trumpist populist messaging that covers Trump's butt. And a robust and confident BBC would be able to say, well, we misrepresented President Trump. We made a bad mistake. We were unfair to President Trump, but we got the broad meaning of President Trump's speech correct. And when you say that we didn't, implying that there was no incitation there when there was, you go screw yourself, because democracy doesn't survive without independent media. It's an essential counter-majoritarian institution. So your dossier, in the guise of rebalancing our mistakes and prejudices, in fact, forms an authoritarian counter-revolution against democratic norms, which we must preserve. So screw you, right? Not screw you on the point of the mistake we made, that it's simple, but screw you on the fact that we got the broad meaning of the speech wrong, right? Then there were criticisms about the coverage of Kamala Harris, implying that the BBC didn't do enough to also robustly investigate and cover Kamala Harris. That's an absurd false equivalence, because there's a lot wrong with Kamala Harris as a candidate. She is a technocratic centrist of the kind that our democracies are not helped by today, to say the least, and indeed that's why she lost. But there is no equivalence between Harris and Trump, because Trump is out to break the democratic game and Harris isn't. So it's not the BBC's job to equalize it. It would be malpractice to equalize it. The Russians have come in on it today, criticizing the BBC. The Israeli government have come in on it today, criticizing the BBC. But the biggest thing of all is Trump coming in on it, and Trump threatening the lawsuit. Of course, Reform and Mr. Farage folks are also coming in on this. Other criticisms of the BBC were around woke and hyper-identity politics. Don't forget, hyper-identity politics is when, as of the 2010s, certain elites in the Western world began to conceive of political disagreement as moral, began to conceive of moral disagreement as about identity, and began to conceive as disagreement and conflict around identity as something that institutions should take sides on and enforce. And here the BBC does have some significant responsibility for bias. That's to say, the really brilliant journalists in the BBC would never do bias around wokeness. You know, it's not something you're going to find from least to set. But the BBC is a very big and a very complex organization, and indeed in many ways is trying to do too much. It should focus on the two tasks that we mentioned earlier. As a result, there are a lot of young people in the BBC. And there's a lot of young people who were too woke for their own good, and who were responsible for content that came out, whether that be on the channels or whether that be on the website. And so a younger generation of people in the BBC, absolutely affected output in a way that the older generation of more experienced folks wouldn't have done. One of the things that the report, the dossier, has a go at with the BBC is trans politics and trans rights discourse. If the BBC were the BBC from the 60s or even the BBC from the year 2000, what it would have done clearly on trans discourse is simply to say that there's a conflict of rights and to try to report each side as faithfully as possible, right? Certain trans activists are saying one thing, certain feminist activists are saying another. There is a political conflict here, and we're going to report how it's working out. Instead, some of the coverage did indeed take the side of one of the parties in conflict, as though this was an issue of rights and human rights, whereas in fact it's an issue of political contestation. And it would have been equally wrong for the BBC in some of its coverage to take the other side in this debate. It needed to report this conflict and debate as politics. Instead, it spoke to the country on this issue as though the country already agreed on something it absolutely didn't agree on. So that's important. And unfortunately, this is actually not going to help. It's actually going to hurt the rights of trans people about whom we care passionately into the future. And this is the bigger story. Wokeism will not help the people it has tended to advocate for. In fact, their status is going to be lowered as wokeism declines relative to what it was before wokeism. And that means we're going to have to re-advocate for trans people, re-advocate for gay people, re-advocate for women, re-advocate for ethnic minorities, because the anti-woke, right-wing, alt-right, post-right, ex-conservative, post-truth authoritarian revolution that is happening across the West isn't actually an anti-woke revolution as it claims to be. It's in fact, in many ways, the revolution against democracy. And that's why it's right to critique woke, but it's also right to point out that 98% of the critique of woke in our culture is actually not just critique of woke, but critique of wokeness aside, the right claims of many important minorities, and in fact, in many respects, democracy itself. So that's the kind of mess that we are in. And what makes me pissed off here is that there are legitimate criticisms of the BBC around balance, about which the BBC should have done more. A. B. The BBC is unable to stand up for itself or defend itself because it is in a position of trouble with governance. It is in a position of conflict within its governance, and it is in a very, very, very defensive position every time it gets attacked. And the more you cower, the more you lose in this age of looming authoritarianism in the West. So the BBC has had some issues. The BBC has had a terrible run of not being able to defend itself around things it's got wrong and things it's got right. But thirdly, and this is probably the big story here, there is an orchestrated campaign against the BBC by people who want to break democratic institutions. And the idea there is described by its advocates as wanting to rebalance the BBC, but in fact, it's the aspiration there is to asphyxiate it. The aspiration is so that the BBC says what Trump and Farage wanted to say. So it's at once anger-inducing, it's at the same time frustrating, because you want to shake the BBC up. Then it's doubly frustrating because the BBC is such a strange organization and so strangely run that you don't really have anybody clear to reach for to shake up, because there's a lot of extraordinary work happening within the BBC. There's a lot of dodgy and sloppy work happening inside the BBC, and there is this terrible problem of governance. Now, one of the problems with governance is that some of the people on the board come from within the organization, within different bits of the organization. Others are appointed by the government. So there's a significant risk of politicization there. This morning, Alistair Campbell rightly remarked that somebody like Sir Robbie Gibb, who ran the communications for a Tory government, being on the BBC board is a bit like Alistair Campbell joining the BBC board after working for Tony Blair, which we would find ridiculous. So there is a real problem with governance that probably needs to be addressed, even though it's very difficult to imagine that it will be, if the BBC is going to regain an equilibrium, regain the capacity to be bold, and regain the capacity to defend itself. The right, when the ex-conservative folks, the ex-right folks, when they critique the BBC, and it's fair, the story there often isn't that the BBC was so terribly and appallingly woke, actually, but it got scared of woke social momentum and just yielded. So funnily enough, the passivity that it showed in the face of woke is manifesting again in a much more dangerous way now against the counter-revolutionary authoritarian wave that's coming to sweep woke away. So that's some of what we're looking at. And the point is, and this is why I'm pissed, this is a ubiquitous story. It's a story about lights on the hill. We can tell the same story about other institutions in other Western countries. It's just that the BBC is the most established one. Now, obviously, one thought about governance is that there should be more bloody journalists on it and more bloody independent journalists as a proportion of the whole. And it's quite right that Alan Rusbridger, the wonderful Alan Rusbridger, ex-editor-in-chief of The Guardian, now then was with Prospect and now leaving Prospect. Alan Rusbridger said, who would you trust more to be on a board like this? Somebody like the amazing journalist Lise Doucette, or various people who have oscillated their careers between journalism and PR and have even worked for governments, So we have this real problem that it's in the interest of too many people that the BBC becomes a political football. And that makes it very hard to leverage the BBC out of being a political football. So it's bad. But this is about keeping two things in mind. You've got to keep in mind the fact that there may be very legitimate and even systemic criticisms of the BBC, and that the BBC may have indeed had some biases, but also that what's coming at the BBC is not a legitimate attempt to rebalance it, but is a plot. Plot is too strong, and coup, as the Observer newspaper ran, that's the term they ran today, ran yesterday. I don't think that's the right word. It's too strong. But what's coming at the BBC is an orchestrated agenda campaign that's aimed not at helping the BBC rebalance itself, but it's aimed to making the BBC commodious, vis-a-vis particular unlovely political enterprises. So I'm pissed. But I'm pissed because this is a story that we're going to keep coming back to. Its effects all of us. Thank you so much for your attention. Lots of love.